Hey guys, Ray Bashir here at Blue Shield Tactical Systems. I wanted to talk today about a situation that's been brought up twice now that I know of by two different officers from two different agencies, and that was they used a technique that was not taught by their defensive tactics program. And so the administrators at those agencies had an issue with that. They said, well, you didn't use something that was in our program that was taught by our instructors, and so now we're going to give you a written reprimand. And why do we have those situations? Why do they exist where we have that disconnect between some administrators and the use of force, or what we like to say, response to resistance? And it goes back really to training. As a use of force instructor, we can get anyone to go in and to regurgitate techniques. But really it's an education of not only your frontline officers, your patrol officers, your detectives, everyone within your agency. It's also an education of the administration sometimes. Some of the people that are in that administration, maybe a sergeant, maybe a lieutenant, maybe all the way up to the chief of the agency or the sheriff of the agency. But there is an education process there that goes on, and there has to be some type of dialogue that's going back and forth between the instructors and that agency, that administration, so that when you have situations like this that come up, and they will come up, that you've already had these discussions. Those things are already in place. So it really goes back to training. And agencies don't need to focus on whether or not something the concept used or the technique necessarily used is something that they've taught, as long as it's reasonable. For instance, you may be out on a firing range that you're taught a certain stance, or certain stances, or you're taught certain movements, and let's say you go out and you're involved in a shooting and you don't use those certain stances, or you don't use those certain movements. It doesn't mean that it's not reasonable, because you were obviously in a situation to use deadly force, someone pointed a gun at you or they shot at you, whatever it may be. So it's not unreasonable in those circumstances just because the certain technique or certain concept wasn't used in that use of force, because obviously there's officers now, some that do train outside the agency, and so they're learning things that are useful, and they're getting to practice them more so than what the agency is actually providing. Because normally in most agencies, guys, police departments, either they don't have a defensive tactics program, or they're not providing with their officers with any kind of training whatsoever. And now they're expecting them to be able to do something that they get taught once a year, or that they learned in an academy 5 years ago. It's really a big disconnect there. I'm not certified. I've said this quite often. I'm not certified with a landscaping brick either. I haven't been trained to use one. But if I'm out and I'm rolling around on the ground with someone who's grabbing at my weapon or something of that nature, then I could use any means necessary to be able to protect myself under those circumstances, and it would be reasonable to do so. So we don't need to focus, like I said, again, on whether or not we're necessarily trained with that individual thing, an individual technique, but at the same time, just focus on whether or not something is reasonable. It's just like we don't go out here and we don't train to use our vehicle necessarily to run over someone if they were shooting at us, or displaying deadly force when we had to use deadly force ourselves, but we've seen officers do it. And it doesn't mean that just because we didn't go through the process of driving a vehicle into a dummy that's on a stick or something else, that we couldn't do that. So I think that there's just a big misunderstanding. Also, those administrators generally that have that problem with that, to say, that technique was not within our what we teach, is because they don't go to the training themselves. When was the last time we saw, or you saw a lieutenant, a captain, a deputy chief, or a chief going to any type of use of force training, defensive tactics training, anything along those lines? And I know there's ones out there that do, don't get me wrong, but most of the time that's not the case. But those are the people that make those decisions on whether or not something is within a policy. And oftentimes those individuals that say, well, that technique wasn't within a policy, they probably don't even understand their policy itself. They probably don't even understand levels of resistance and how to define those levels of resistance, which is important, to be able to do that. So like I said, I think there's a big misunderstanding there, and how do we get past that? Again, we have to have dialogue with our command staff and throughout the department. There has to be regular updated training on policy within the agency. What is reasonable force? And those definitions of it, because my definition of something that's reasonable, if you go to another agency and they see this particular thing, it may be a strike to the face, and they may say, well, that's unreasonable. You can't hit people. And so the reason being is because they're not looking at the entire picture, of what we do, and what the Supreme Court under Graham versus Connor has also ruled, that what is reasonable, is it objectively reasonable under the circumstances. So it's not necessarily, guys, focusing on technique itself and saying, oh, well, this is not within the department. I mean, because what if that technique fails? What if that officer hasn't been taught something that necessarily applies to that situation? Then, them using something that maybe they've learned outside of the department, or they just improvise. As long as it's reasonable under those circumstances, it's okay. So I don't understand it. Like I said, I know of 2 different circumstances I've been made aware of, and I don't really understand it why those agencies focus on, well, it's not within it's in our policy. I can't imagine working under that type of circumstance where if you feel like you use something that is not necessarily taught within the agency, that you're going to be punished for it. I would be, obviously worried about using force in general, and we have so many officers that are in that situation because they work for an agency where training is not provided. And really, those agencies that don't provide training, guys, are putting themselves in such a liability. They're so liability conscious, most of them as well, but they don't realize that the situation they're putting their agency in by not training. So most of the situations like this, again, goes back to lack of training and lack of communication. So that's something that, as an instructor for your agency, that you should be focusing on. Communication with your command staff, educating them on what you're teaching, why you're teaching it, and that something can be outside of what you're teaching and still be reasonable and still be okay. So it's also up to you guys. So you hopefully as instructors, you guys are doing that, or if you're a trainer with your agency. And if you don't have a program, get a program started, guys. Again, if the Department of Justice comes into your agency and starts pulling files, they're going to be looking for some type of training that you guys are doing, some type of de-escalation, some type of defensive tactics, firearms training, all those things that go into it. So you definitely want to be on the right path. So guys, if you ever have any questions, you can contact us at blueshieldtactical.com.